We're going to start discussing individual microorganisms by talking about bacteria. So bacteria is the oldest life form on Earth. It's been around longer than anything else. We think it's the first living thing that ever existed. So they're single-celled organisms, so they're always going to be one cell, and they contain unique DNA, which means that each bacteria has a different genetic makeup from all the other strains of bacteria. So they can live in the most extreme environments. So we've found bacteria everywhere from the Arctic to the deepest parts of the ocean. So they're single-cell organisms, they can live in extreme environments, and they all have their unique genetic makeup. So bacteria reproduce mostly through a process called binary fission. So this binary fission is where one bacterium is actually going to split into two. But it's exactly like cloning in that the daughter cell ends up being exactly identical to the parent cell. So when they split, you start to see two of those nucleic centers, and they're going to separate out, and then they're slowly going to divide into two separate pieces. So while they are two separate pieces, they are genetically identical because of that binary fission process. They're just replicating and separating. So they do grow in what we call bacterial colonies. Some colonies can get so large you can actually see them with the naked eye. Remember, we talked about they're very small, and so you typically would need a microscope to see an individual bacteria. But those colonies you are going to be able to see with your naked eye. Now, their growth can be slowed by cold, heat, and salting. So when you think about that, that's all ways we preserve food. So we put our food in a refrigerator, which is cold. We cook our food in order to kill bacteria, which is heat. And we actually will even salt our food to keep it safe for longer. This is actually a really important technique before we started having modern day refrigerators. They used to salt meat more often. So these will all slow bacterial growth, which is actually the purpose of that, those food preservation processes like pasturing or freezing food that will help slow down bacterial growth. So we are going to talk about the good and the bad of bacteria, because we do need bacteria to live, but it can also be harmful. So we're going to start by talking about the good aspects of bacteria. So first, it's really good for our environment, so it has some environmental good. So it's a huge part of the nitrogen cycle. We actually rely on it for that decomposition piece, so that breakdown of nitrogen into our atmosphere, which actually will enable us to have nitrogen in our ecosystem, which is important because humans need nitrogen for survival. It's also extremely important to decomposition. So again, that recycling of nutrients, that whole process of the food cycle wouldn't be possible without bacteria. And for people, it's really good because we have lots of bacteria in food. So things like cheese, yogurt, a lot of our dairy products are really rich in bacteria, which is also why we worry about that food preservation piece a lot with them. So for medicines, they can actually help us produce antibiotics, which is actually what we're going to use to cure bacterial infections as well. And then even for genetic engineering, we're starting to be able to change genes of certain bacteria in order to make insecticides and pesticides, and using that as a more natural form of insect control or of pest control. All right, and now the bad of bacteria. So we do have a lot of bacteria that is pathogenous. So we talked about pathogens being harmful. Pathogenous means it is disease causing. So our bacteria that are pathogenic are tuberculosis, things like Lyme disease, even strep throat is a bacterial infection, and MRSA, which is a really important one for hospitals to worry about because of all of the stuff that goes on in a hospital involving bacteria. So MRSA is a big one there. And so we have all these different types of bacterial infections that are pathogenic. So there are several ways we can treat it. The most common is with antibiotics like penicillin or amoxicillin, but this could actually lead to antibiotic resistance over time if it's overprescribed, if it's overused. So through that binary fission process, our bacteria are going to reproduce. And if the bacteria in your body especially those that could be pathogenic, are used to those antibiotics, they can actually develop a resistance there, which is how we get resistant strains of certain diseases and of certain bacterial infections. So strep throat is a big one where we're really having to focus on that antibiotic resistance right now to make sure that our medicines are still effective in curing it. And it can also be prevented by vaccines. So vaccines actually trigger the body to produce its own antibodies. So these are its own chemicals and its own defensive system that are going to essentially be prepared for when they see those bacteria. That vaccine, they'll already know what it looks like. It's kind of like putting up a wanted poster. It's like, oh, I know what this looks like. Now I'm prepared to go get it. So that's where those vaccines come in to help bacterial infections.